My question is Britain broken?
I'm sorry, you're wrong. It's not a zero-sum game.
This for me is manifest nonsense.
There's one final dismal twist.
Oh, hang on, let's reverse that.
I don't want to look into Keir Starmer's heart. I have no idea. I think he's
It must drive you absolutely potty seeing the same mistakes made again and again and again.
the Treasury is deeply reluctant to take anybody from the private sector. A dismal scenario where we've recruited people who cannot possibly manage the stuff that they're responsible for managing. You're not allowed to evaluate the past record of a civil servant when they apply for a job. It's clearly a problem that the civil service is not competent to do the jobs that it's been asked to do.
Well, how have we got to this absurd situation of motivating people to give up work and sit at home collecting benefits?
Once in a blue moon, along comes an idea which sounds better than my idea.
Paul Collier, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us today. You are an accomplished economist, author of several books specializing on inequality mainly. My first question is, when we drive around Britain, we see pockets of disparate poverty in one of the most advanced economies in the world still. So my question is Britain broken?
I think it's regionally, it's broken. Nationally, it's not broken. Nationally, we've still got a huge set of potential, but it's ridiculously skewed. It's more skewed than anywhere else in Europe that I know of. It's more skewed than America. It's quite extraordinary. And I grew up in a city that used to provide jobs for the future, Sheffield, and it doesn't anymore, sadly. Young people in Sheffield are faced with a choice of staying put and reaching a ceiling, or getting out.
So why is this? So if you go to the great cities in the north, Liverpool, Manchester, you can see and look it up, they used to have their own stock markets in their heyday. And now Britain, and for many years, has been very much focused on London and the southeast. And this has been an issue well known to politicians for decades. And yet we still have this big divergence in income and opportunity between London, southeast, and the rest of the UK. What's going on here?
I think it's partly a commitment, an ideology, a belief that markets know best, which is exaggerated. For some things, markets do know best, but trying to solve where should future jobs be all around the country, leaving that to the market, is catastrophic. Because later on, we probably get an opportunity to explore why it's catastrophic. But that was the belief of the British Treasury, still is the belief of the British Treasury. And it's an amazing concentration of power in a very few people in London.
So inequality in Britain, in your view, is poor. Like you, obviously not to your level in scholarship. I'm a graduate in economics. And so when, from an economics speak perspective, we talk about inequality, when we measure it mathematically, we talk about this thing called the Gini coefficient. Could you, for our listeners, just explain what the Gini coefficient is, and in layman's terms, how it's constructed, and how it's evolved in Britain?
Yeah, so it's not the best measure of inequality, first of all, let me say that. But it's one measure. It's a snapshot of people's incomes around the country at one moment in time. So it will count me as being on quite a high income as a professor at Oxford, you two, and my 18-year-old kid. It'll count as income zero, 19-year-old kid, income zero, 25-year-old kid in London doing quite well, right? But it's that snapshot. Now, why is it a very poor measure? Because a better measure is what I call life chances. And that's if you start in the bottom, say, third of the population, as I did, what are your chances by the time you're my age that you've reached the top third? That's the sort of social mobility point. Um, and there, Britain is a disaster. And that's the tragedy, because that's the more meaningful measure of inequality. Young people starting their lives want to know, are the chances against me all cooked, preset, or if I try hard, can I rise?
Okay, so let's just break this down. So social mobility, you measure what kind of income bracket your parents are in, and then where you land up in mid-career. How do you actually measure social mobility?
No, exactly as you say.
Okay.
You track people. You track people through their life.
Great. So
And,
so
and you
social
can
mobility
take
is more.
snaps-
Would you say social mobility is more important to improve than worry about actual differences in income? What's more important is, so you would say that it's fairer if you can work really hard and work your way up to wealth, rather than whether we're not just trying to equalize everybody because we think that is an end in its own.
Yeah, I think it is a better psychological measure. If you look in Britain, young people 18 to 25 are really worried about the future, and that is a devastating critique of British economic policy, because with the pace of technological change, we should be able to lift all boats, um, in the sense of everybody should have a better life, absolutely. And if you try hard, starting from the bottom third, you should be able to reach the top third through effort and talent.
Completely agree. So can you give an example? So when we're trying to look at policy prescriptions for politicians to follow to improve the metric in hand, social mobility, one thing we do, of course, is we look around the world to collect data on different countries and try and figure out, for the countries which are doing better, why are they doing better? So can you give an example of a country which has great social mobility and
Yep, I mean,
why it's doing?
absolutely top of the class is Denmark, right? Um, uh, Pretty well all the Nordics, and a lot of the Baltics are way above Britain, but Denmark's interesting because it's no natural advantages. We've had North Sea oil for donkey's years. They've got nothing. Um, we've got a economists, some of the top universities in the world. They've got an okay University of Copenhagen, but it's not, it's not in the top flight. So we've got huge advantages over Denmark, and yet we're much poorer per capita, and much less equal.
So
So
why has Denmark got such better social mobility? What are the policy prescriptions here?
Yeah, so they've done some fairly obvious things. They trained young people in skills of the future, and they've encouraged firms to have the finance which enables them to first get startups and then get scale-ups. So a good network of local finance, locally based, and of course they've also got nationally based finance, but it's spread across the country. So you've got opportunity wherever you live in Denmark. So that's the key difference is this ability to finance innovation. They're a very innovative place, not just in one area. If you want to go to find where are the most exciting architects in the world, apparently it's Denmark. Where's the most exciting food in the world, apparently, is restaurants in Denmark. Um, where's the really innovative firms in, say, high tech? Well, there's Novo Disco that's hugely profitable. Novo Disco is run as a foundation, so it's a much more equal business than any of the West Coast American startups.
So Britain, through London and Edinburgh, are one of the most advanced financial centres in the world. Global finance and local finance across Britain through the city of London. So I'm trying to understand why Denmark beats Britain in funding innovation.
Because it's so skewed. The venture capital industry based in London doesn't really reach beyond a golden triangle of London itself and Oxford and Cambridge. Partly Oxford and Cambridge are included because a lot of them went to university there and so like going back. So there's no difficulty. If you're a startup in Oxford, you can raise finance. If you're a scale-up in Cambridge, you can raise finance. But if you're a startup in Sheffield, or even in Manchester, you struggle because there isn't a network of local finance for innovation in the same way. And you look at the infrastructure, that's one part of the architecture for economic growth, finance for startups and scale-ups. But there's much more in an ecosystem that's good for business.
And to look at another, obviously the biggest economy in the world, the United States of America, they have arguably a lower tax base and more entrepreneurship. Their income per capita has, since being on a similar level to most Western European countries in the 80s, has sort of taken off and is now, I don't know, 40, 50, 60% higher than Western European countries. They finance innovation. They also have, I think I have not you will probably have the data at your fingertips, but they have big inequality in the United States as well, with, the biggest spectrum, the greatest opulence and wealth one end to the most desperate poverty at the other end. So how do we square that circle? The United States has this high Gini coefficient,
Yeah.
a big
Yeah.
innovation, big finance, but big inequality.
So first of all, it's not so badly skewed regionally, because America's got state governors with quite a lot of power, mayors of cities with quite a lot of power, and so you've got locally based finance in pretty well every region. So that skew isn't so bad. For the top end stuff, and of course the growth in America is being driven by the big seven, the Googles of this world, Microsoft, all the rest of it, and they are in a little nest in California, obviously on the West Coast, and that nest has two features that make it feasible there. One is they've got a very, very good top-end university, Stanford, and that does the really fancy stuff, the training, the high brain power of the future for innovation. But then you've also got in California an enormous amount of finance for innovation. You've got huge pool of finance from previously wealthy people who are prepared to take a risk because they know that they've understood the psychology of a portfolio, that not everything's going to work. You only need 1 in 10 to work, and it's still worth hacking. Um, in in Britain, we don't have that philosophy
But
outside London.
capital is global, and the guys sitting in, Silicon Valley in California, I'm sure they have a propensity to invest more in American startups because that's the sort of geographical pull, English language, and so on. But thanks to the English language, they are just as open to great opportunities in Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and anywhere in the world where they can communicate in English. So it's not just the capital. I would argue that there might be some other factors, such as in America, there's less red tape on hiring and firing people. There is a lower tax burden on profits for entrepreneurship and investment in America compared to the United Kingdom today. How do you view these factors in the growth and augmentation of wealth in Britain versus America?
I think that's completely right, that you have got a much better ecosystem that rewards innovation and risk taking. In Britain, you've got that. In London, but only for one sector, which is the financial industry. And we've got a massively inflated financial sector linked to, because we've got such a complex bureaucracy, it's God's gift to lawyers. And so we've got this nest of magic circle law firms, which are basically servicing the financial sector, the financial industry. And that is the constellation of high incomes in Britain. It doesn't spread, as I said, beyond Oxford, Cambridge, and London itself. And that's a huge skew in opportunity. It doesn't spread to provincial England. And I was going to say, eventually, because that opportunity doesn't spread, people mutiny. And that was the Brexit move. Every region of England voted for Brexit, which was shooting itself in the foot. But by then, they've got to a mentality where if London wants to stay, we don't want to stay.
So focusing on the regional question, the second biggest city today in Britain, I think, is Birmingham. Manchester maybe third, something like that. And Manchester's obviously in the news these days with our friend Andy Burnham looking to take Makerfield and maybe take the crown in number 10 if he's able to win the by-election. And there's been much made, particularly not least by Andy Burnham himself, of how that Manchester's been this wonderful success story. And I've seen it with my own eyes. I first visited Manchester at the end of the 90s, and vast swathes of it were industrial wasteland. I went back in the early noughties. Again, it didn't seem a particularly pleasant place. It was always raining when I went there. It's the wettest place in Britain, apparently. And then I went there after a big gap, plus 20-year gap. I was there last October, and I was amazed. Beautifully restored Victorian buildings, sitting in the streets seamlessly with gleaming, amazing towers. Really smart, a real vibe. People with a spring in their steps, queuing to go around the block to go to a theatre shows. Really lovely top-end restaurants. It felt wealthy and vibrant, and it was a big contrast to the doom and gloom we get fed by the media the whole time. Some would argue that is because the city has run up enormous debts, and successive governments led by the Conservatives, which Andy Burnham fails to mention, have invested hugely in the city in the last 20 years. And that must be the case, by the way, because there's no way these gleaming towers appeared in the space of just over a year since Starmer got elected in July 24. So Manchester seems to counter your point, unless you go with my point that, well, actually it's just storing up debt, and if you go outside a sort of central circle of gleaming towers, Manchester still is quite down at heel.
Well, unfortunately, it is. There's some very brilliant recent work on the willingness of investors to invest in Manchester and other provincial cities. And until the global financial crisis, 2008, until then, the risk premium on investing in Birmingham or Manchester was the same as the risk premium on investing in London. So there was no differentiation. If Britain as a whole looked bad, investment fell across the board. But since 2008, that's changed, unfortunately. And now all the provincial cities, including Manchester, are viewed as much more risky than investing in London. And that is a very worrying phenomenon. So London has more or less converged on how risky is investing in Paris or in Berlin, whereas the provincial cities of England are now looking really like the risk premium of UK debt compared with Romanian debt. Right? You pay a lot more on Romanian debt because it sounds pretty risky. You pay a lot more now on investing in a building in Manchester than in a building in London. And that's very right. So a lot of the glitz you see was put in place up to 2008. And you won't see as much glitz now since 2008. Right? There's some, but not very much.
So what is the
And that-
solution looking forwards? We are where we are. There's still massive concentration of wealth and global finance, global legal firms, where countries from all over the world will submit themselves to English law for their transactions, even though the business goes nowhere near the United Kingdom. And we have this disparity, which seems to have got worse between London and the rest of Britain. What would be your policy prescriptions to fix this and stop this massive pressure for everyone to move to the southeast of Britain for opportunity?
Yeah, so you have to change expectations. You have to change investor expectations. They have to have good reason to think, Manchester's actually going to be a pretty smart place to invest. Right? Now, Andy Burnham himself has done his best to talk it up. Right? And I will say one thing that really has helped enormously in Manchester compared to anywhere else, and that is Andy Burnham inherited a very effective civil service in Manchester. The local civil service were created by a guy called Howard Bernstein. And Howard Bernstein's a fascinating little story, if we can have a vignette on him for a moment. He joined the city council in Manchester when he was 16 as a tea boy. He no qualifications. It was a long time ago, right? 16 years old, tea boy. But he was really smart up here. And they spotted that he was smart and kept promoting him. By the age of 30, he got promoted all the way up to be chief executive of the city council. And then he built a fantastic team. And so Manchester City Council is really effective. They know so much more about Manchester than the Treasury does, that they can shame the Treasury into taking them seriously. So Andy Burnham is very willing to acknowledge that. He inherited and benefited from the legacy that Howard Bernstein achieved. So that's one big plus that he had that nobody else has. And that building a competent local civil service, that has to be built. That takes time. What we can do to change expectations is say, public money will be put into helping innovation in Manchester. We'll actually fund startups and scale-ups in Manchester. We've actually got an institution that functions exactly like that, but it does so for opportunities abroad. Which is ironic. We've got a brilliant 60-year-old institution called British International Investment, and that's a publicly funded money to create opportunities in poor places. So it invests a lot of money in India, a lot of money in bits of Africa, and it's a very smart bunch of young people who are very good at spotting opportunities, financing them. It would be nice if we had the equivalent of British International Investment investing in Britain. We don't. Germany has a brilliant organization called KfW. If only we had that sort of institution in Britain. We've got the very elementary rudiments of such an institution, and we need to build on it. But it's poignant that it's taken such a long time to do the obvious.
Thank you. I think Patrick had a question as well to follow up the.
I was been fascinating listening to your conversation, and both Guy and I, Paul, have read your latest book or last book, Left Behind. Now, I have to be aware I'm talking to two economists, Oxford and Cambridge, so this one may be Economics 101.
It's good on a video link, so
Exactly. Keep me distant. Sparks will fly. But I was on the plane flying back from Liverpool, which I like to talk about in a moment, and this weird question kept coming into my mind, which is, and you talked about how absolute growth should help everybody, a rising tide lifts all boats. But a question came to me, which is, surely for someone to win, someone else must lose. Can we talk in a binary term around gain?
Well, in terms of absolute growth, it isn't a zero-sum game at all. The genius of capitalism is that it can actually make everybody more productive. So it isn't a zero-sum game. Just because Liverpool became more productive, does that mean London's less productive? No. If Liverpool became more productive, would that hurt Manchester? I'd argue that it would help Manchester, because then you'd have a cluster of a northwest region spreading from Liverpool to Manchester, where both were growing. That would be helpful. So, I'm sorry, you're wrong. It's not a zero-sum game. That's the genius of capitalism. We can all grow. We can all become more productive. Or, as in Britain, we can all become less productive, which is the genius that as Pat suggested earlier, that's what we're sort of contriving in Britain, with it getting more and more bureaucratic, more and more difficult to do things.
Yes, so kind of putting my American capitalist hat on now, perhaps I've listened to too many American podcasts, but there was another part of me which was thinking, well, look, you know, we can talk about institutional structure, we can cut the cake multiple different ways, but ultimately we are talking about an individual's ability to control their future. And within the country, the individual can move to the area where the opportunity is greatest and take advantage of that. So there's a part of me, the American capitalist, going, yeah, buddy, of course it's harder there and easier here, but you can still move and you have agency within the structures you exist in. What would be your answer to that?
It's not a good system if all the opportunity happens in one part of the country. And that would be tragic, because it would face young people in the poor parts of this country with an agonizing choice. Do you stay with your family and friends and miss an opportunity? Or do you say, bye, Dad, bye, Mom, bye, friends, I'm off? And we shouldn't be facing the bulk of the country with that choice, which at the moment in Britain we are. America does that to a much less acute extent. It's true that the really whiz stuff is over in the West Coast in California, but there's still significant opportunities spread all across America, really.
Thank you. So we're talking, is Britain broken is our question. And Guy and I traveled across the UK last year, as you know, for our documentary Should Brits Come Home? And we encountered frustration everywhere with the system. I was looking around for bogeymen in Left Behind, and I think the Treasury comes up for the most amount of rounds fired at it from your pen. Is it do we have one bogeyman, or is it every single time we look at an element of the system there's dysfunction there and we need to work on all of those elements at once?
I start with the Treasury. It really is a very powerful institution. We're the only country in the OECD that doesn't have a separate Ministry of Economy looking at long term. I mean, this is crazy because the Treasury is entirely fixated on the annual budget. All ministries of finance, that's their job, the annual budget, and it makes everything very short-termist. Everywhere else has this counter-ministry, Ministry of Economy, that's tasked with long-term perspective. We don't. And so nobody in Britain is taking a long-term perspective, except, of course, businesses. They have to plan ahead. So the private sector is planning ahead, but the public sector isn't.
Can I pose another potential issue, which I think, one of my theories about problems at the Treasury is there's been this general leftward drift in thinking and towards more and more sort of command economy, top-down type thinking, particularly from the Treasury. And apparently every time a new chancellor walks in, they're given an enormous spreadsheet of all the spending and all the taxes and so on. Politically, no politician or very few politicians have been brave enough to suggest cutting spending. It seems to be this ever-growing, metastasizing cancer, although it's got so out of hand now that even when they came in, of course, the Labour Party were trying to make some very modest cuts to the welfare budget, but then were shouted down by their extreme left-wing backbenchers. But when it comes to sort of the tax side of the balance sheet, they are, rather the P&L, they are, they don't believe in the Laffer curve. They seem to think that you can keep putting up tax rates and there's a linear increase in tax revenue. This, for me, is manifest nonsense. And yet, there has been propaganda coming out of the Treasury for a long time denying the existence of the Laffer curve at a tiny micro level. When I've mentioned the Laffer curve in your Facebook posts over the last 5 years, I'm shouted down by people who don't know anything about economics because they've bought into the propaganda coming up from the likes of the Treasury. And yet, when George Osborne became Chancellor of the Exchequer in 2010, he cut corporate tax rates, corporate tax revenue increased. We're now seeing the opposite happen. Rachel Reeves has been pushing tax rates and is sort of plateauing and about to fall, in some cases already falling. Why can't we get some common sense back, or economics 101 back in the Treasury, and realize that we can solve everyone's problems, make everyone happy by cutting tax rates in Britain and seeing revenues go up and people working harder and investment capital flooding in?
I think the problem is the short-termism, because if you value everything just in terms of a 2 or 3 year horizon, which is the maximum the Treasury is ever prepared to look, then of course cutting rates looks suicidal. Your revenue goes down. But if you took a longer view and said, this is what a Ministry of Economy would do. It would say, but it's suicidal if we're losing opportunities all over the country because we're not investing in startups and scale-ups and the ecosystem of business in most of the country, we're throwing away a lot of talent. So it's not even the Laffer curve. It's that you're just trying to think, what is the horizon for discounting benefits? And the Treasury's horizon is so short that, of course, no investment in the future is going to be worthwhile.
I think so, yes. And from personal experience, and Patrick as well, you see across the civil service, people are in jobs for very short periods of time. 2 years would be a long stint. And so everyone's working towards their 1 year, 2 year sort of target to prove themselves, and so don't really care about what happens beyond. So? Do you think there's a sort of institutional, cultural issue of short-termism, and the solution is to try and change that to longer-term positions being held and therefore longer-term incentives?
That's part of it. I don't want to cheer you up, Patrick, but it's worse than that. It's that these young people go in fast track, so the Treasury is their first job, right? And what's been their education? Well, they've been taught by people like me, uh, fancy economics, MPhil, usually that level, 2 years of, they got a first in economics, and then they got 2 years on and a good master's degree, and in they go to the Treasury. Right? I've loads of my students have done that in the past.
So it's not your fault.
My colleagues, I now blame my colleagues. I repented. I repented of all that stuff a long time ago. But what we don't teach is any practical skills like how to build a railway. You might have heard of HS2, which is a tragedy, something between a tragedy and tragicomedy. We spent over 100 billion on it. It won't be finished till about 2040. And when it is finished, it will run from Birmingham to London and nowhere else.
I read an article about that, which I think sums up the nonsense of HS2 last year, where their annual report had a significantly larger section on DEI, ESG issues than it did on the actual numbers. It could have been an order of magnitude larger. So.
Yeah, completely. And so these kids are not trained in anything that is useful. And they're fast-tracked in, and the Treasury doesn't recruit anybody who's in later life with more experience. If you compare it with the French Treasury, the French Ministry of Finance, they have a much more, first of all, they recruit from the Grande École. The Grande École train in practical skills, like if you want to build roads, you'd go to the Grande École for roads and bridges. If you want to learn about how to manage a rail network, you'd go and learn that. So you come in with much more richer set of skills, and is much more porous. You can come in from the private sector. The Treasury is deeply reluctant to take anybody from the private sector. They're scared of the private sector, I think, because the private sector is motivated by profit. And we, as honorable civil servants, are motivated by the public interest. It's that sort of philosophy. And, heaven help us. So this is a dismal scenario where we've recruited people who cannot possibly manage the stuff that they're responsible for managing. We've then got an appalling system of promotion, which is so incredible. I better not describe it, but basically, it's not based on promotion on merit. You're not allowed to evaluate the past record of a civil servant when they apply for a job.
That's the first time I've heard that. I can't believe my ears.
Yeah, yeah,
Unbelievable. Was
yeah.
that a change at some stage in the recent years, or
I think it's got more restrictive because it could be seen as bias.
so?
So you
Is this DEI?
I guess it is. Yeah,
So
yeah.
in other words, so anti-meritocracy.
Uh, um, yes, I mean that's what it amounts to, but it's masquerading as we've got to protect people from bias. You could be favoring men over women or whatever, and so we don't want to have that sort of opportunity for judgment.
So not to mince words, this is the sort of so-called diversity initiatives saying if you are someone like you, me, and Paddy, so white, middle-aged, born in Britain, you're now at the bottom of the pile to create more opportunity for others not like you.
I don't want to feed sort of paranoia or anything like that. So, but I think it's clearly a problem that the civil service is not competent to do the jobs that it's been asked to do. And that is manifest in so many areas of failure. And there's one final dismal twist, which is the Treasury's diagnosis of why things are not working. You ready for it? Things are not working because we in the Treasury don't have enough power. We don't have enough control. It involves more control by the Treasury, and so you centralize. You centralize more decisions in the Treasury. And of course, we're wildly over-centralized in the Treasury already, but centralizing more, you get rid of layers of local government, you get rid of anything that's obstacles to Treasury power. And this is such a devastating misdiagnosis of why things are not working. But that's the spiral we've been in. 30 years ago, Britain and France were equally centralized, right? Both pretty highly centralized systems, very highly centralized systems. For the last 30 years, France has been devolving, in shifting powers to regions and mayors. And Britain's been doing the opposite. And so now the French system is much less centralized than the British.
So, Paul, when I was in Liverpool, having read your book Left Behind, which both Guy and I have read, it makes a very clear case for leadership being so important. You mentioned Singapore, for example, Rwanda, you could go to all these different places around the world. And as I'm walking the streets of Liverpool, I'm seeing, I'm afraid to say, quite a lot of filth. I mean, rubbish absolutely everywhere on the streets. And the local people saying this is just how it is. No bins, no collections, underfunded services, austerities. I was thinking to myself, okay, I get it. I can go with decentralization. I like the idea, but these people can't even manage their bins, thinking about the council here. So what would you say to that essentially? Because it seems like the leadership ain't that great at the decentralized level either.
I think that's not fair on Liverpool. I think Steve Rotherham is not a bad leader in Liverpool, quite a good one, I think. And Andy Burnham in Manchester's quite a good leader, I think, for Manchester. The problem for them both is that they've been set up to fail because the budget to local government has been massively cut. And what's left of the budget is being stuffed with what's called statutory duties. And so about half of the money they've still got is earmarked by Whitehall for various specific things they have to do. And that leaves them with so little discretionary spending that they're bound to fail in a lot of different things. It's a choice in a place like Liverpool of what do you fail on. In Birmingham, which you highlight as a really dysfunctional city, that is indeed. Don't forget there are two mayors of Birmingham. There's Birmingham City, which is a catastrophe and is now under special measures, and the City Region Authority, which until 3 years ago was pretty well run by Andy Street, who was, if you remember, before he was mayor of the City Region Authority, he was the chief executive of John Lewis, which is a much admired company, where he got practical business experience. But Manchester region was quite well managed under his authority, although he got very little money. Birmingham City was a catastrophe right from the start. And that's where you've got the rats in the streets and the piles of rubbish. So why is that still there? Because it's a one-party state, Birmingham, at the moment. It's just a Labour city.
Well, so I'll take my focus then back to London, where all roads lead, obviously, in this story. There's a couple of arcs, really. I mean, we've had a lot of changes of government and leader, and they usually come in with a desire to work with the civil service and be the sensible grown-up in the room. And then at some point, the government then becomes extremely frustrated with the civil service. And there's usually lip service to, we're going to decentralize, we're going to devolve as well. It must drive you absolutely potty seeing the same mistakes made again and again and again.
Absolutely. I mean, I watched this with Boris Johnson. I watched it under David Cameron, really. And there was a moment with Boris Johnson where it looked as if something was happening. We had a department called Levelling Up, and I was roped in as the pro bono advisor for that. And I gradually realized it was a farce. It was a charade. There was no money awarded to the. Michael Gove courageously went on television saying, "This is the main mission of the government." Now, it shouldn't have been Michael Gove to say it. It should have been Boris Johnson. If it's the main mission of the government, you put money into it. When Michael Gove said, "This is the main mission of our government," he knew in reality that no money was being allocated. I very much wanted him to resign, and that would have been the honest thing to do. He was in an agony over whether to basically put the party first or the country first, and unfortunately, he chose the party, loyalty to the party. I think he probably regrets it now.
And when we were traveling around the country for our documentary last year, both Guy and I picked up on this frustration, and we did speak to experts, including professors like Dr. David Betts, talking about a forthcoming civil unrest / strife / civil war. I'm presuming that the logical outcome of nothing changing is that eventually the population rise up. It's surely the only outcome that's predictable now, given that we can see that successive governments haven't made the structural, ideological, economic changes that we've been talking about today.
I think civil war's the miscategorization. We have a civil war. It's riots. We've had riots. We've already had riots in the streets. We'll have some more. But there's a further option for people, and that's just despair. And I think that's the passive reaction. Anger is one reaction, produce riots, but then when people are jailed and suppressed, the final step is despair. And we've seen that um, in what's called deaths of despair. People deciding, there's no point, there's no future for me, and so they take crack or something to cheer themselves up, and or they just literally commit suicide. The two places with the highest adult male suicide rate in the country are Blackpool and Grimsby. Right?
I went to Blackpool this year. I was at a ball not far away at the end of January, and so I wanted to go and see Blackpool, and it was a horror show. It was a zombie movie set right on the front, what should be the best part. And you go one street behind, it's a sense of humor name for one of the shops selling rock, called its name and logo there was Rock Bottom, and it was
Yeah,
yeah. So this seems to be the epitome of sort of local pockets of decline. Clearly, it's happened over decades and decades and decades after a Victorian heyday.
absolutely. And this is a complete tragedy, uh, utterly utterly avoidable. Utterly avoidable. If you think about it, what will be future opportunities for Blackpool? Um, it's it's got loads, very good conference facilities still. It could be uh, a, a world class centre for events, fun events. You could smarten up the whole front so that it became an exciting place that's successful. And instead, we've got this catastrophe. It's an avoidable tragedy. If only we'd seen that coming and said, "What's the future possibilities for places like Blackpool?"
Isn't this an
Uh,
example, though, of what happens when you have welfare dependency? I'm sure that if we drove Art Laffer around Britain, he's 85, but a sprightly sort of 35-year-old when he's physically jumping around and energetically talking. And he would say, it's very, very simple. If we want to stop people smoking, we put taxes up on smoking. If if we want to stop people speeding, we fine people for speeding. If we want to stop people from working, we put more tax on work.
yeah,
Hang on. Let's reverse that. Let's lower the taxes on work so there's better incentives to work and keep more of what you earn in your own pocket. And on the other side, let's make it less desirable to sit at home watching television, collecting benefits.
I
And
completely agree with.
very recently, as shocking, a two-parent family with two kids today in Britain, if both the parents are earning 50,000-60,000 pounds a year pre-tax, if you look into their collective take-home pay and the costs of living and all the rest of it, they would be better off on benefits today.
Of course.
And
Uh,
also,
there's
how have we got to this absurd situation of motivating people to give up work and sit at home collecting benefits?
Yeah, I mean, this is the needs problem. And we've got the needs problem, not in employment, education, or training. And the this is so avoidable that it makes you weep with frustration.
So
And
we're all
we've
sitting
got
here in our echo chamber saying this is so obvious, this is so obvious. If it is so obvious, why cannot politicians grasp this situation and turn it around? Because Britain is manifestly declining. Its GDP per capita is going nowhere and falling further and further down international league tables, for example. Why can't anyone see what is as plain on their nose on their face?
yeah, the how this ends is I think um, it ends in a crisis that is too big to ignore, so that the Treasury then has to rethink. We may well be at that point in Britain now, where, as you said, when Keir Starmer came in, he promised all sorts of things, and then got himself incredibly frustrated that nothing happened. He thought he made loads of ludicrous mistakes, but they all end up with this deep frustration that the civil service, and especially it shrinks to the Treasury, unfortunately. The Treasury is tasked with things that it's just not competent to do. And until we change that system, we're stuck. It will change, I think, through manifest failure that triggers a financial crisis.
Paul, when we traveled around the country, we found that when we talked with people from the left and the right, we were really trying to get a spectrum of views. The left have a narrative which is, well, it's the 1%, the millionaires. It's also the system and the state working against you, the working man. And the right, or various right groups, have the narrative which is, oh, it's the immigrants, they're stealing your job and raising prices and making it harder to get a house. Do you have any sympathy with either one of those views, or do you think the answer lies elsewhere?
I think we're just completely barking up the wrong tree with these things. Of course, if we had an attractive environment for young people, foreigners would come in, they'd be welcome. They wouldn't be seen as a threat. We'd be hoping to get high-skilled foreigners coming in. At the moment, the tragedy is what we're attracting is rather low-skilled foreigners, because if you come from a really poor country in Africa, even Britain looks good opportunities. And so, what's been happening is the skilled Europeans who came in over the last 15 years are now leaving, and that's being replaced by these very low-skilled people, and that's a very disturbing phenomenon. It's nothing to do with race or anything like that. It's just to do with skill levels and ambition.
Yes. Guy and I actually met a couple from Ghana who'd emigrated to the UK and had lived and worked there. And they actually said to both of us, or most of the guys, that the situation's so bad in the UK now that we want to go back to Ghana because we see more life opportunities there. And
Yes.
thinking about that
Right.
couple, I realized, gosh, you have so much international mobility now that, of course, the quality people are quite capable of leaving the UK. It's not a once in a lifetime decision to go to the UK from Africa. They're more than able to go back, and there are many areas in Africa which are seeing phenomenal growth.
That's right.
Of
Completely.
course, it's those people, as you've said, who are I don't want to call them lower quality, but just less educated, less skilled, less mobile, who stay. And so the net effect is, of course, a drain on the economy, not growth.
And they were lifelong Labour voters and utterly furious. This was in August last year, so just over a year into sort of Starmageddon, and almost fizzing up with anger about this Labour government and how they would never vote Labour again. And now, because Ghana's been growing and they're fed up with Britain and the high tax rates, that they would like to go back to Ghana. Extraordinary. And
Yeah.
that brings me now, you said just now that, Paul, how Keir Starmer came in and was surprised by not being able to deliver on what he's promised. I have a different theory. I just think he absolutely is going towards this communist ideal. And he's just said what he had to say to get elected and says what people want to hear while he's elected, while all the way going in the opposite direction. So, for example, he comes in on the promise of smashing the gangs. Of course, illegal boat crossings in rubber dinghies across the channel has just been growing and growing and growing. There's not been the slightest attempt to smash the gangs at all. And we know that even in its current state, the British tools of state can move very rapidly when they want to. Just look at the riots shortly after Starmer got in. by his perceived so-called right-wing thugs, he managed to crush that brutally within a week of orchestrating the police and the courts to lock him up. The state could stop the boat crossings within 24 hours if it wanted to. I believe it's just a question of willpower, and there is no willpower whatsoever. What do you say?
I don't want to look into Keir Starmer's heart. I have no idea. I think he's a frustrated lawyer, really. I think he's extremely unsuited to be a prime minister because he's not a very good communicator. And one skill that you really need as a prime minister is to craft a narrative which you explain to people what is going to happen, and then you stick to it. We don't need missions and resets and relaunches and goodness what targets and that sort of thing. So I think it's been an extraordinary rapid meltdown. He's not yet 2 years into government, and he's already odds on to be pushed out. So that's a sort of unproductive question, I think, is what's in Keir Starmer's heart. He's going to be history probably very soon. I think a better question is to say what practically can be done to restore national growth around the country, not just in these pockets. And I come back to the principle that that's the genius of capitalism, is all boats really can rise. So that practical, pragmatic actions that work for a while. I'll close with a little story of George Soros. George Soros, very good friend of mine, long time. And I first got to know him about 25 years ago. And he phoned me up when I was director of research at the World Bank. And he said, I've been following your work. And I think it's a fertile fallacy. Can I come and talk to you? And I heard the word fallacy. I thought that sounds, mildly insulting. But yeah, by all means, come and talk to me, right? And what I now know that George Soros wakes up in the morning each day and says, what's new in the world? Suppose that all the things I believed are now wrong. What ideas are out there that are better than the ideas I have? And he says, the world is awash with new ideas, nearly all stupid. And so I stick with my own ideas. And then once in a blue moon, along comes an idea which sounds better than my idea. And those are the fertile fallacies. They'll end up being wrong because very few things last forever. So this idea of yours might last for 30 years, but that's a big improvement on what I've got now. So that's a fertile fallacy. So that's how George made $30 billion, which is his net worth by the time he'd finished investing in markets. And I'm now in the business of generating fertile fallacies. They won't last forever, but they'll be good enough to get us out of the present hole.
Well, Paul, that is a fantastic note to finish on. We are very grateful for you talking to us. As all great talks are, it's left us wanting more, and I'm going to certainly be thinking for the rest of the day about fertile fallacies.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks both. Thanks a lot. And we can get out of this hole. Let's hope we do so as quickly as possible.
Indeed. Thank you.